France has just fired the latest shot in a trade war that no one saw coming. While the United States has long been used to calling the shots in global commerce, it looks like it may have underestimated its European ally. With tensions escalating fast, automakers, politicians, and economic leaders are scrambling to figure out what happens next. It all started with a bold move from Washington in early 2025. President Donald Trump approved a massive 25% tariff on steel and aluminum imports, aiming to protect American manufacturers from foreign competition. On paper, the policy made sense for U.S. businesses. It was designed to keep domestic industries strong, secure jobs, and reduce reliance on international suppliers. But what Washington may not have fully anticipated was just how quickly France would strike back. French Foreign Minister Jean-Noël Barrot wasted no time in making France's position clear. In an urgent press conference, he declared that neither France nor the European Union would simply stand by while their industries suffered. This wasn't just political rhetoric. France's response was immediate, strategic, and aggressive. The French government swiftly began drafting countermeasures, working closely with European leaders to craft a collective response that could shake up global trade dynamics. The first and most immediate victims of this trade war, automakers. The automotive industry relies heavily on steel and aluminum for vehicle production, and with the new tariffs in place, the cost of these materials skyrocketed overnight. Car manufacturers suddenly found themselves facing a difficult choice: absorb the higher costs and take a hit to their profit margins, or pass the price increases onto consumers. Neither option was ideal for companies like Renault, Peugeot, and Citroën, which rely on affordable production materials to maintain competitive pricing. The tariffs posed a serious challenge, and it wasn't just French brands feeling the pressure. BMW, Volkswagen, and Mercedes-Benz, major European automakers with a strong presence in the United States, were also hit hard. A 25% increase in material costs meant a potential spike in car prices, something that could significantly impact demand in an already volatile market. But the implications of these tariffs go beyond just the price of new cars. Supply chains, which have been carefully optimized over decades, were suddenly thrown into chaos. Steel and aluminum that once moved freely between suppliers and manufacturers were now burdened with heavy import taxes, making it more expensive to transport materials across borders. Factories that relied on a steady flow of raw materials were forced to rethink production schedules, and some manufacturers even began considering shifting their operations outside of the US altogether. The timing of this trade war couldn't be worse. The global automotive industry is already dealing with massive challenges: rising production costs, the transition to electric vehicles, and ongoing semiconductor shortages. Add in a sudden trade conflict between two major economic powers, and the pressure becomes nearly unbearable. The last thing automakers needed was another obstacle standing in their way. The French government knew that retaliating against the US was risky, but it also understood that doing nothing was not an option. The European Union has long positioned itself as a major force in global trade, and allowing Washington to dictate economic terms without resistance would have set a dangerous precedent. France's response was designed to send a clear message, not just to the US, but to the entire global market. And the message was received loud and clear. Almost immediately, European leaders began discussing coordinated countermeasures. President Emmanuel Macron pushed for a unified response, arguing that if Europe wanted to maintain its economic strength, it needed to stand together. Other EU nations quickly voiced their support, and within days, discussions were already underway regarding potential retaliatory tariffs on American goods. The situation is evolving rapidly, and no one knows exactly how this trade war will play out. Will France's countermeasures be enough to force the US to reconsider its tariffs, or will Washington double down, escalating the situation even further? The next steps will be crucial in determining the future of transatlantic trade. As the trade war between the United States and France escalates, it is becoming increasingly clear that this is not just a short-term dispute. It is a strategic realignment of economic power, and France is making moves that could permanently alter its trade relationships. While US tariffs have created an immediate financial burden for European industries, France is not sitting back and waiting for the storm to pass. Instead, it is actively reshaping its economic strategy, forging new alliances, and securing its place as a dominant force in global trade. One of the most significant shifts in France's approach has been its deepening trade relationship with China. As tensions with the US rise, France has been strengthening its economic ties with Beijing in an effort to reduce its dependence on American markets. Trade between France and China reached an astonishing $8.9 billion in 2023, marking a historic high and demonstrating just how crucial this partnership has become. President Emmanuel Macron's visit to Beijing in April 2023 was not just a diplomatic gesture, it resulted in 18 major cooperation agreements across multiple sectors, including aviation, agriculture, and, most importantly, automotive technology. This pivot toward China is not just a reaction to US tariffs. It is a long-term strategic move that could reshape the global auto industry. China is the undisputed leader in electric vehicle battery production, and as automakers transition toward a future dominated by EVs, access to cutting-edge battery technology is more valuable than ever. By strengthening its trade relationship with China, France is ensuring that its automotive industry remains competitive, even if access to US markets becomes more restricted. French automakers are already seeing the benefits of this shift. Companies like Renault and Peugeot are exploring joint ventures with Chinese manufacturers to gain access to advanced battery technology and production capabilities. This collaboration could give European car brands an edge in the global EV market, helping them keep pace with competitors like Tesla and expanding their presence in the booming Asian automotive sector. But while strengthening economic ties with China offers new opportunities, the trade war with the United States is still creating major disruptions across the European automotive supply chain. The 25% tariff on steel and aluminum imports has thrown manufacturing operations into turmoil, making it more expensive for automakers to source the raw materials they need. European manufacturers that were once able to move material seamlessly across borders are now facing increased costs and logistical challenges. Airbus CEO Guillaume Faury recently hinted that if tariffs continue to make transatlantic trade too costly, the aerospace giant could begin prioritizing non-US customers. This statement sent shockwaves through the European manufacturing sector, as it highlighted the growing frustration among European businesses over US trade policies. The auto industry, which depends on similar global supply chains, is now facing difficult decisions about whether to shift production to other regions or absorb rising costs. For automakers, the ripple effects of these tariffs are being felt at every stage of production. The cost of steel and aluminum is rising, vehicle prices are climbing, and manufacturers are struggling to balance affordability with profitability. Some companies are considering shifting parts of their production to regions with fewer trade restrictions, while others are exploring alternative suppliers in Asia and South America. And then there is the question of consumer demand. As vehicle prices increase due to higher production costs, car buyers could start holding off on purchases, leading to a potential drop in sales. If that happens, automakers will face an even tighter financial squeeze, forcing them to make tough choices about workforce reductions, supply chain restructuring, and long-term investment strategies. The real concern is that this is only the beginning. If France and the European Union continue to retaliate against US trade policies and Washington responds with further tariffs, the situation could escalate into a full-blown trade war. This would not only disrupt the auto industry but also affect other major sectors, such as aerospace, agriculture, and energy. France is staying on the offensive, using its new trade partnerships as a way to counterbalance the economic pressure coming from Washington. By deepening ties with China and other emerging markets, France is working to protect its industries from the long-term consequences of American tariffs. But the question remains, will these efforts be enough to shield France from economic fallout, or is the auto industry heading into a period of prolonged instability? As automakers and global business leaders watch closely, one thing is certain, this is no longer just about steel and aluminum. The decisions being made today will shape the future of international trade, and the automotive industry is right at the center of it all. Whether this crisis leads to new economic alliances or further divides between global powers remains to be seen, but one thing is clear, the stakes have never been higher. As the trade war between the United States and France intensifies, the European Union is stepping up to defend its industries. France may have been the first to retaliate against the US tariffs, but it is no longer fighting this battle alone. European leaders are beginning to recognize that this is not just a French problem, it is a direct attack on the EU's economic stability. If the US continues down this path, it will not just be facing pushback from Paris, it will be taking on the entire European bloc. French President Emmanuel Macron has been vocal in his call for a unified EU response, arguing that Europe cannot afford to let Washington dictate the terms of global trade without resistance. The European Union has a history of responding aggressively to economic threats, and there is no reason to believe this situation will be any different. Brussels is already laying the groundwork for retaliatory tariffs on American goods, and while diplomatic channels remain open, European officials are making it clear that they are prepared to strike back if necessary. For Europe's auto industry, this is a fight that feels deeply personal. The EU has built one of the strongest automotive manufacturing sectors in the world, exporting millions of vehicles annually to markets across the globe. If a trade war disrupts supply chains, inflates production costs, and weakens demand, European automakers could find themselves struggling to maintain their competitive edge. Many of these companies have spent decades refining their operations, optimizing supply chains, and expanding their presence in the US market. Now, all of that is at risk. European automakers are already looking for ways to insulate themselves from the potential fallout. One of the most significant moves they are making is diversifying their trade partnerships. Instead of relying so heavily on the US, they are accelerating efforts to strengthen relationships with alternative markets. France, in particular, has been aggressive in expanding its trade footprint in Asia, where China has now become its largest trading partner on the continent. This shift is not just about avoiding the effects of US tariffs, it is about securing long-term stability in an increasingly unpredictable trade environment. Automakers are realizing that putting too much trust in the American market carries significant risks, and they are taking steps to ensure they are not left vulnerable if tensions continue to rise. For European car manufacturers, this diversification strategy opens up a wealth of new opportunities. Emerging markets in Asia and South America are becoming increasingly important for global trade, and automakers that establish strong relationships in these regions will be well positioned for future growth. Partnerships will allow them to tap into new consumer bases, engage in technological collaborations, and reduce their exposure to trade volatility with the United States. The impact of these trade shifts is already being felt. Chinese investment in the European auto industry is growing, with major deals being signed between European and Chinese manufacturers. Joint ventures are becoming more common, particularly in the electric vehicle sector, where China holds a dominant position in battery production. By working closely with Chinese partners, European automakers are gaining access to advanced battery technology, which will be crucial as they transition to an EV-dominated future. But while this strategy offers long-term benefits, it does not change the immediate reality that European automakers are currently facing. The US tariffs are already in effect, and the cost of doing business is rising. Companies are being forced to rethink their production strategies, weigh the benefits of relocating certain operations, and decide how to absorb or pass on additional expenses. One of the most concerning aspects of this trade conflict is the potential for further escalation. If the US responds to European countermeasures with even stricter trade policies, the situation could spiral into a prolonged economic standoff. The EU is preparing for this possibility, but the consequences could be severe. A full-scale trade war between two of the world's largest economic powers would send shockwaves through global markets, affecting industries far beyond just automotive manufacturing. European leaders are still hoping for a resolution that avoids further economic damage. Trade negotiations between Washington and Brussels are ongoing, but progress has been slow. The US has shown little willingness to back down from its protectionist stance, and unless a compromise is reached, Europe will have no choice but to continue pushing back. As the trade conflict between the United States and France continues to unfold, it is becoming clear that this battle is about more than just tariffs. The decisions being made now will shape the future of US-EU relations and could permanently alter the global economic landscape. Both sides have dug in, with Washington standing by its tariffs and France, along with the European Union, refusing to back down. The longer this standoff continues, the harder it will be to repair the economic and political damage that is being done. One of the biggest concerns is how this trade war will impact transatlantic relations in the long term. The US and the EU have long been strategic partners, not just in trade but in global diplomacy, defense, and economic cooperation. However, these recent disputes are testing that alliance in ways that have not been seen before. Trust between Washington and Brussels is eroding, and if a resolution is not reached soon, the relationship may never fully recover. For the automotive industry, the consequences of this dispute are becoming increasingly severe. European automakers have relied on the US market for decades, exporting hundreds of thousands of vehicles each year to American consumers. Now, with the prospect of a 25% tariff on European car imports, companies like Volkswagen, BMW, and Mercedes-Benz are being forced to rethink their business strategies. If these tariffs are implemented, European car manufacturers will have a difficult choice to make. They can either absorb the increased cost themselves, which would cut into their profits, or they can pass the additional expenses onto consumers, making their vehicles significantly more expensive in the US market. Neither option is ideal, and both could result in lower sales and job losses across the industry. The situation is just as problematic for American automakers. If the EU retaliates with its own tariffs on US-made cars, companies like Ford and General Motors could see a sharp decline in their European sales. Many US automakers rely on the European market to sell high-end models and electric vehicles, and losing access to that customer base would be a major financial setback. This trade dispute has put automakers in a difficult position. Industry leaders are now pressuring policymakers to reach a resolution before the situation worsens. While companies can adjust to short-term fluctuations in tariffs and trade policies, long-term uncertainty is much harder to navigate. If this conflict drags on for months or even years, it could force major changes in supply chains, manufacturing locations, and investment strategies. The biggest question now is whether the US and EU can reach a compromise before the situation spirals further out of control. There are some signs that both sides are open to negotiations, but progress has been slow. Neither Washington nor Brussels wants to appear weak by conceding too much ground, and domestic political pressures are making it difficult for leaders to make the necessary compromises. If no deal is reached, the consequences will extend far beyond just the auto industry. Other sectors, including agriculture, technology, and energy, could also be affected as trade barriers continue to rise. This could lead to higher prices for consumers, slower economic growth, and increased instability in global markets. France's bold counterstrike against US tariffs has already reshaped international trade dynamics, and the effects of this decision are still unfolding. The European Union is now looking beyond its traditional partners and strengthening economic ties with China and other emerging markets. If the US continues to impose tariffs and trade restrictions, it may find itself increasingly isolated as global trade routes shift away from American control. Manufacturers must now adapt to a rapidly changing landscape. Supply chains will need to be restructured, cost-cutting measures will become more critical, and companies will have to innovate to stay competitive in an environment where trade barriers are becoming the new normal. This is not just a temporary setback. It is a transformation of how global trade operates. The real challenge will be finding a way forward that allows both the US and the EU to maintain strong economic ties without compromising their national interests. A prolonged trade war benefits no one, and the sooner a resolution is reached, the better it will be for businesses and consumers on both sides of the Atlantic. The world is watching closely. Will the US and the EU come to an agreement before the situation escalates further, or are we witnessing a fundamental shift in the way international trade operates, one that will redefine global commerce for years to come? The road ahead is uncertain, but one thing is clear: the decisions made today will shape the economic future for decades.